It was late September when I found myself in an old, creaky house that my cousin had inherited. The house had belonged to an elderly relative we didn't know well, a great-aunt who had passed away a few months prior. The family had put off clearing out the place for a while, and since I had some free time on my hands, I offered to help. The house was located in a remote area of the country, deep in the woods, and it was a place no one in the family had bothered with for years, not even when she was alive. I remember feeling uneasy the moment we drove up to it. It was a Victorian-style home, weathered by age and neglect. The windows were grimy, some cracked, and the paint had long since peeled away from the wooden siding. Tall trees loomed over the structure, casting long shadows across the yard, even though it was only midday. There was something about the place that just didn't feel right, and it was more than just the typical unease of being in an old, isolated house. I brushed it off as my imagination. After all, I wasn't superstitious. I didn't believe in ghosts or the paranormal, and I was determined not to let a few creaks and groans of an old house get to me. My cousin Sarah was already there when I arrived. She was staying the night, but I had initially planned to drive back home before dark. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Sarah suggested that I stay overnight. The drive back was long, and she figured it would be safer than being on the road in the dark. Reluctantly, I agreed. We spent the next few hours going through the piles of old clothes, furniture, and personal belongings that cluttered the house. There was nothing particularly unusual about most of it, just the expected odds and ends one accumulates over a lifetime. But then in one of the upstairs bedrooms we found a locked trunk. It was an old, heavy thing, covered in dust, and the lock looked rusted shut. Curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to pry it open with a crowbar we found in the basement. As the lock gave way with a loud snap, the lid creaked open, revealing its contents. Inside were old, yellowed photographs, a few leather-bound journals, and a strange-looking doll. It was a porcelain doll, dressed in a frilly, old-fashioned dress, but its face was unnervingly lifelike. Its eyes seemed to glisten in the dim light, almost as if they were following us as we moved around the room. Sarah and I exchanged uneasy glances. We shrugged it off, though. People back then had a different taste for dolls, I told myself. We sifted through the journals, and while most were filled with mundane entries about daily life, one stood out. It was different from the others, and the writing inside grew increasingly erratic. The entries spoke of strange noises in the house, feelings of being watched, and vivid nightmares involving the doll. The journal was signed by my great-aunt, and it was clear she had become obsessed with the doll in her later years. There were even sketches of it on several pages, as if she couldn't stop thinking about it. The sun had set by the time we finished sorting through the trunk, and the air in the house had grown cold. We decided to call it a night and head to bed. Sarah took one of the upstairs bedrooms, and I settled into a room down the hall. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had crept over me since we opened that trunk, but I told myself I was being ridiculous. After all, it was just an old doll. I woke up sometime after midnight to the sound of footsteps. At first I thought it was Sarah, but the steps were slow and deliberate, heavier than hers. My heart began to race and I strained to listen in the dark. The footsteps moved up and down the hallway outside my door, pausing every so often before continuing. I lay frozen in bed, my mind racing with all kinds of explanations. Perhaps it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal had somehow gotten inside. I listened for what felt like hours before the footsteps finally stopped. I didn't sleep much after that. The atmosphere in the house had changed. It felt oppressive, almost as if the walls were closing in. When morning came, I found Sarah in the kitchen, looking as tired as I felt. She told me she had heard the footsteps too, pacing up and down the hallway all night. We laughed it off, joking that it was just the old house playing tricks on us, but there was an undercurrent of unease in our conversation. We spent the next day clearing out more rooms, trying to distract ourselves from the strange events of the night before. The day passed uneventfully, but as evening approached, that same sense of dread began to creep back. By now the house felt different to me. It was as though we weren't alone, as though something unseen was watching us from the shadows. That night, I had the worst nightmare of my life. I was lying in bed, unable to move, while the doll from the trunk stood at the foot of my bed, its glassy eyes fixed on me. It slowly climbed up onto the bed and crawled toward me, its porcelain face contorting into a grotesque smile. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as the doll reached me, I woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around the room, disoriented, trying to convince myself it was just a dream. But then I heard it. The sound of something moving in the hallway outside my door. The footsteps were back, only this time they were more frantic, as if someone, or something, was running. I could hear them moving from room to room, the doors creaking open and slamming shut, one after the other. I pulled the covers over my head, praying for the noise to stop. It went on like this for what felt like hours, but eventually the house grew quiet again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, Sarah and I were both on edge. Neither of us mentioned what had happened during the night, but I could tell from the look on her face that she had experienced something similar. We went about our tasks in silence, trying to pretend everything was normal. But the tension between us was palpable. The house had taken on a sinister energy, and I knew we couldn't stay there much longer. As we packed up to leave later that afternoon, I went upstairs one last time to grab some of my things. When I entered my bedroom, I froze. Sitting on the bed, in the exact spot I had seen it in my dream, was the doll. Its glassy eyes stared at me, unblinking. I hadn't brought it into the room. In fact, I hadn't touched it since we found it in the trunk. My skin crawled as I backed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran downstairs and found Sarah in the kitchen, ready to leave. I didn't mention the doll, not wanting to sound crazy, but I could tell by the look on her face that she had experienced something too. Without saying a word, we loaded up the car and left the house behind. As we drove away, I glanced back at the house one last time. It stood there, silent and foreboding, as if it were watching us leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still inside, lurking in the shadows, waiting for us to return. We never did. A few weeks later, I received a call from Sarah. She had been going through some of the belongings we had brought back from the house, and she had found something strange. One of the journals from the trunk had a final entry we hadn't seen before. It was written in a shaky hand, and it spoke of the doll coming to life, tormenting my great-aunt in her final days. The last line sent chills down my spine. It's always watching. It never leaves. That was the last time I ever spoke of the house, the doll, or the strange events that happened there. I don't know if I believe in the supernatural, but I do know that some things are better left unexplained. To this day, I still have nightmares about that house. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I can still hear the sound of footsteps pacing outside my bedroom door. It was a chilly Saturday morning in late October when I stumbled across the car boot sale. The air was crisp, and a faint mist clung to the ground, making everything look slightly more mysterious than usual. I hadn't planned on going, but I had woken up early and felt restless, so I decided to take a drive and see if I could find anything interesting. I'd always loved the unpredictability of car boot sales. You never knew what kind of odd treasures you might find, hidden among the old books, clothes, and dusty antiques. There was a certain thrill in rummaging through people's forgotten belongings, hoping to discover something rare or valuable. It was like a real-world treasure hunt. I arrived at the field where the sale was being held just after 8 a.m. The place was already bustling with vendors setting up their tables, unpacking boxes, and displaying their items. I wandered from stall to stall, not looking for anything in particular, but enjoying the atmosphere. Most of the sellers were friendly, eager to chat about their items, and willing to haggle on prices. After about an hour of browsing, I'd picked up a few small things, a couple of old records, a vintage picture frame, and an old leather-bound book that had caught my eye. As I was about to leave, I noticed a small stall tucked away at the far end of the field, away from the main cluster of vendors. It was manned by an older woman, probably in her late 60s or early 70s, with short gray hair and deep wrinkles etched into her face. Her stall was sparse compared to the others, just a small wooden table with a few items laid out, nothing particularly eye-catching. But something about the stall drew me in. As I approached, the woman looked up and smiled faintly, her eyes narrowing as if she had expected me. I glanced over the items on her table: an old clock, a few tarnished pieces of jewelry, and a strange-looking wooden box. The box was about the size of a shoebox, but much heavier. It was intricately carved with strange, swirling patterns, almost like runes, though I couldn't quite place the style. The wood was dark and smooth to the touch, worn down with age. I picked it up, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It was heavier than it looked, almost unnaturally so. There was no visible hinge or latch, but something about it intrigued me. I turned to the woman and asked, "How much for the box?" She hesitated for a moment, her smile fading slightly. "It's an old thing," she said, her voice low and raspy. "I'm not sure you'll want it. It's got some history to it." I raised an eyebrow, curious now. "What kind of history?" The woman shrugged, but I noticed a flicker of something in her eyes. Fear, perhaps. "It belonged to someone in my family a long time ago. It's been passed down, but no one really wants it anymore. Some say it's cursed, but that's just superstition, isn't it?" She laughed, but the sound was forced, as if she wasn't entirely convinced herself. I chuckled, trying to put her at ease. "I don't believe in curses," I said, pulling out my wallet. "How much?" She stared at me for a long moment, her eyes studying my face before finally answering, £10. Without thinking twice, I handed her the money, and she slid the box toward me, almost as if she couldn't wait to be rid of it. As I walked away, I glanced back over my shoulder. The woman was still watching me, her expression unreadable. For a moment I felt a strange chill run down my spine, but I shrugged it off. It was just an old box, nothing to worry about. When I got home, I put the box on the kitchen table and set about putting away the rest of the things I'd bought. The box sat there, untouched, for the rest of the day. It wasn't until later that evening, when I was sitting alone in the living room, that I decided to take a closer look. I carried it into the living room and placed it on the coffee table in front of me. As I studied the carvings again, I noticed something I hadn't before. Small, almost imperceptible symbols etched into the wood, hidden among the swirling patterns. They were faint, but they seemed to form some kind of language or code, though I couldn't make sense of it. I tried to open the box, but it wouldn't budge. There was no obvious way to unlock it, no keyhole, no latch, nothing. I ran my fingers along the edges, trying to find a seam, but it felt like the whole thing was sealed shut. Frustrated, I set it back down and decided to leave it for another time. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to shake a feeling of unease that had settled over me since I'd brought the box home. I kept hearing faint creaking noises coming from the living room, like the sound of wood expanding and contracting, but every time I got up to check, the house was still and quiet. It wasn't until around 3 a.m. that I finally drifted off into a restless sleep. I woke up the next morning feeling exhausted, but the box was the first thing on my mind. I went into the living room to check on it, half expecting it to have opened itself in the night, but it was exactly where I'd left it, still sealed, still heavy, still inscrutable. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen around the house. It started small at first. Objects would go missing, only to turn up in odd places later. The TV would switch channels on its own, and the lights would flicker occasionally. I chalked it up to faulty wiring or my own forgetfulness, but the feeling of unease continued to grow. Then, one night I heard it, a faint whispering sound, coming from the living room. At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe the neighbors outside, but when I went to investigate, the room was empty. The whispering stopped the moment I entered the room, but as soon as I turned my back to leave, it started again. It was coming from the box. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart racing, as the whispering grew louder. It wasn't in English or any language I recognized. It was low and guttural, like the sound of something ancient and malevolent. My skin crawled as I realized that the box was no longer just an old carved piece of wood. It was something else, something alive. I wanted to get rid of it, but for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to do it. Every time I thought about taking it to a charity shop or throwing it away, I felt a strange compulsion to keep it, as if the box had some kind of hold over me. The next few weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and growing paranoia. The whispering continued, sometimes loud enough to wake me from a dead sleep. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and I began to see figures standing in the dark, just beyond the edge of the light. I knew it was the box. I knew it was responsible for everything that was happening, but I couldn't bring myself to open it or destroy it. It was as if the box didn't want to be opened, but at the same time, it didn't want to be left alone. One night, after another particularly disturbing encounter with the whispering, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed the box and drove out to the nearest field, far away from my house, intending to leave it there. I thought if I could just get rid of it, everything would go back to normal. But as I stood in the middle of the field, the box in my hands, I hesitated. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something terrible would happen if I abandoned it. My hand shook as I looked down at the box, and for the first time, I felt a deep, primal fear, a fear that something inside the box was watching me, waiting. I drove home that night, the box still in my possession. I didn't sleep. The next morning I made up my mind. I had to open it. Whatever was inside, I needed to face it. I grabbed a hammer and chisel and went to work, prying at the seams of the box, determined to break it open. It took hours of effort, but eventually I managed to crack it. Inside was a small, crumpled piece of parchment covered in the same strange symbols that were etched on the outside of the box. As I unfolded it, the whispering returned, louder now, more insistent. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe on the page, almost as if they were alive. I felt dizzy, nauseous as the room began to spin around me. Then suddenly, the whispering stopped. The room went silent. I stared at the parchment in my hands, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. I didn't understand what had just happened, but somehow I knew the box's hold on me had been broken. I burned the parchment that night, and the box with it. The whispering never returned, and the strange occurrences around the house stopped. To this day, I still don't know what was inside that box or what its purpose was. But every now and then I wonder, what if I hadn't opened it? What if I had just left it alone? Would the whispering have eventually consumed me? Would I have become another victim of whatever curse the old woman had warned me about? I'll never know for sure. But one thing is certain, I'll never buy anything from a car boot sale again. It was mid-November, and I was on one of my regular long-haul trips, moving freight from St. Louis to Albuquerque. I'd been driving trucks for the better part of 2 decades at that point, so I was used to the long, lonely stretches of highway. Night driving didn't bother me much anymore either. In fact, I almost preferred it. Fewer cars on the road, fewer distractions. But this trip, well, it was different. Something happened out there on the road that I still can't fully explain. It's been years now, but I can't shake the memory. I had just crossed into Oklahoma from Missouri, following Highway 44 westbound. It was nearing midnight, and the only light came from the occasional truck stop or rest area, their neon signs flickering in the distance. My CB radio was mostly silent, save for the occasional chatter from other drivers. The road stretched on endlessly, flanked by thick forests on either side, and I had a good 600 miles to go before I'd even consider stopping for the night. I was making good time, cruising along at a steady 65 miles per hour. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the pavement were almost hypnotic. I knew this stretch of road well. It was one of my usual routes. But on that particular night, something felt off. The air seemed heavier, the darkness a little deeper than usual. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just tired, maybe a little burned out from the constant driving. As I approached the town of Miami, Oklahoma, I noticed the fuel gauge was getting low. I made a mental note to stop at the next truck stop to fill up and grab some coffee. There was one coming up about 20 miles down the road. Nothing fancy, just a mom-and-pop joint with a couple of fuel pumps and a small diner. But I'd been there before. It would do the job. The truck stop came into view, its dim lights glowing in the distance like a beacon. I pulled in, the gravel crunching under my tires as I eased the rig into a parking space. The place was nearly deserted. Just a couple of other trucks parked out front, their drivers probably catching some shut-eye in the sleeper cabins. I climbed out of the cab, stretched my legs, and made my way toward the diner. The place was quiet, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft clink of dishes from the kitchen. A tired-looking waitress in her mid-50s gave me a nod as I slid into a booth by the window. "Coffee?" she asked, not bothering with a menu. "Yeah, thanks," I replied, glancing out the window. The parking lot was barely lit, and the trees surrounding the stop seemed to press in on all sides, their branches swaying gently in the wind. She brought me my coffee and disappeared back into the kitchen. I sat there for a while, sipping the bitter brew and staring out into the night. That's when I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing just beyond the edge of the parking lot, where the light faded into the darkness. At first I thought it was another driver, maybe taking a smoke break or stretching his legs. But as I looked closer, something about the way the figure stood bothered me. It was completely still, unnaturally still. No movement at all, not even a shift of weight or a turn of the head. I squinted, trying to get a better look. The figure seemed tall, too tall really, and was dressed in what looked like a long, dark coat. It was hard to make out any details in the dim light, but something about it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned my attention back to my coffee, telling myself I was just seeing things. Maybe it was a shadow or a trick of the light. I was tired after all. But when I glanced out the window again, the figure was still there, standing in the exact same spot, still as a statue. I decided it was time to leave. I paid for my coffee, nodded to the waitress, and headed back to my truck. As I walked across the parking lot, I kept glancing toward the spot where I had seen the figure, but now there was nothing there, just darkness. I climbed into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out of the truck stop, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. I turned the radio up, hoping the noise would help me focus, but my mind kept wandering back to that figure. There was something about the way it had just stood there, watching, or at least I felt like it was watching me. The next couple of hours were uneventful. I made good time, the highway stretching out before me in an endless ribbon of asphalt. But that feeling of being watched never quite left me. It lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me as the miles ticked by. It was around 2 a.m. when I spotted something in the distance, a pair of headlights coming up fast behind me. At first I figured it was just another trucker passing through, but as the vehicle got closer, I realized it wasn't a truck at all. It was a car, and it was moving fast, way too fast for this stretch of road. I slowed down a bit, expecting the car to pass me, but instead it pulled up right behind me, tailgating dangerously close. Its high beams were on, blinding me through the side mirrors. I cursed under my breath, tapping the brakes to signal the driver to back off, but the car stayed right on my bumper, its headlights glaring into the cab. Frustrated, I turned on the CB and called out to see if anyone else was on the road. "Anybody out there see a maniac tailgating on 44 heading westbound?" The radio crackled with static, but no one responded. The car stayed behind me for what felt like an eternity, and then, without warning, it swerved into the left lane and sped up alongside me. I glanced over as it passed, and that's when I saw it. My heart skipped a beat, and my hands tightened on the steering wheel. The driver's seat was empty. I blinked, thinking maybe I hadn't seen it right, but the car sped past me, the empty seat clearly visible. There was no driver, no one at all. The car roared ahead of me, disappearing into the darkness ahead. I stared after it, my mind racing. I'd been driving for hours, sure, but I wasn't hallucinating. I knew what I'd seen. There was no one in that car. No one. My first instinct was to pull over and take a break, but the thought of stopping on that empty highway, alone in the middle of the night, made my skin crawl. I decided to keep driving, hoping that I could make it to the next town without any more strange encounters. About an hour later, I saw the faint glow of headlights up ahead, coming from the shoulder of the road. As I got closer, I realized it was the same car, the one that had passed me earlier. It was parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing. I slowed down as I approached, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. The car was still empty. No sign of a driver. No sign of anyone at all. I drove past it slowly, half expecting something or someone to jump out at me. But nothing happened. The car just sat there, motionless, its lights flashing in the dark. For the next few miles, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting the car to reappear behind me. But it didn't. The road was empty again, and the only sound was the hum of my engine and the low whine of the wind outside. Finally, around 4 a.m., I reached the outskirts of Oklahoma City. The city lights were a welcome sight after the long, eerie stretch of highway. I pulled into a well-lit truck stop, parked the rig, and sat there for a while, trying to process what had happened. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize what I saw. Maybe the car was some kind of autonomous vehicle, I told myself, though deep down I knew that wasn't it. And as for the figure I'd seen at the first truck stop, well, I still don't have an explanation for that. Maybe it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. Or maybe it was something else. Something I don't want to think about. I still drive that route from time to time, but I always feel a sense of unease when I pass through that stretch of highway. I keep expecting to see that car again, parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights flashing, waiting. I've told a few other truckers about what happened that night, but most of them just laugh it off or chalk it up to fatigue. Maybe they're right. Maybe I was just tired. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget it. It's funny how life on the road can make you feel invincible sometimes. You get used to being out there alone, dealing with all kinds of dangers, weather, breakdowns, reckless drivers. But every now and then, something happens that reminds you just how small and vulnerable you really are, out there in the vastness of the night. And that night, I felt it more than ever. Something was out there, watching. And for a few terrifying hours, I was sure it was coming for me. I still wonder every time I drive that stretch of highway if it's waiting for me to come back. It was supposed to be a simple weekend outing, a quick stop at a local flea market where I'd hoped to find some vintage trinkets for my small collection. What I walked away with instead was something far more unsettling. Something I would later regret purchasing. That day, as I browsed through the stalls, I came across an elderly woman selling various items, old books, kitchenware, and a few vintage dolls. Most of the dolls were porcelain with cracked faces and faded clothes, but one stood out immediately. It was a small, handmade cloth doll, its face painted in a childlike expression. There was nothing particularly striking about it, yet I found myself inexplicably drawn to it. The woman noticed my interest and spoke up in a low voice. "That one's special," she said, almost as if it were a warning. "Been with me a long time, but it's time to pass it on." At the time, her words didn't register with me as odd. I was more focused on the simplicity of the doll, thinking it would be an interesting addition to my collection of oddities. Without asking further questions, I handed her $10, and she gave me the doll wrapped in an old cloth. As I turned to leave, she called out, "Take care with it." Once home, I placed the doll on a shelf in my study, alongside the other antique items I'd collected over the years. That night, as I settled into bed, I felt an odd sense of unease. The house was quiet, as it usually was, but I had the strange feeling that I wasn't alone. I brushed it off, chalking it up to exhaustion from a long day of walking around the flea market. Over the next few days, little things started happening. I would come into the room to find the doll in a different position than I had left it. At first, I thought I had simply knocked it over or that it had shifted naturally. Then I began hearing soft noises in the night, creaking sounds, almost like footsteps. Again, I told myself it was the house settling or the wind outside. But then things escalated. One evening I returned home late from work, exhausted, and immediately noticed something was wrong. The air in the house felt heavy, like a thick fog had settled inside. When I walked into my study, I froze. The doll, which I had placed on the shelf earlier that week, was now sitting in the center of my desk, facing the door, its painted eyes seemingly staring right at me. I hadn't moved it. No one else had been in the house. A chill ran down my spine, and I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Eventually, I convinced myself I must have moved it earlier and forgotten. I picked it up, placed it back on the shelf, and went about my evening, though the unease lingered. That night, the real terror began. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft whispers. At first I thought it was the wind, or maybe the TV downstairs, but as I listened more closely, I realized the sound was coming from inside the room. I lay there frozen, heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The whispers were faint but distinct, like multiple voices murmuring at once. Slowly I sat up and turned on the bedside lamp, scanning the room. That's when I saw it. The doll was no longer on the shelf. It was sitting in the chair by the window, its small, painted face turned toward me. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. I knew I hadn't put it there. There was no way it could have moved on its own, right? I jumped out of bed, grabbed the doll, and stuffed it into a box in the closet, slamming the door shut. That night I barely slept, my mind racing with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The next morning I told myself it was all in my head. I was overreacting, letting my imagination get the best of me. But as the day went on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night I decided to get rid of the doll. I drove out to a nearby field, miles from town, and tossed the doll into a dumpster. As I turned to leave, I couldn't help but glance back, half expecting it to somehow appear in my car or standing in the road. But it was gone, buried in the trash where I hoped it would stay. For a few nights, things were quiet. The house felt normal again, and I began to relax, thinking that whatever strange occurrences had been happening were over. But then one night I heard the whispers again, louder this time, closer. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing, and my eyes darted to the closet. Slowly I got out of bed and approached the door. My hands shook as I opened it, expecting to find the doll inside, but there was nothing there. Just the box where I had left it days ago, empty. I stood there in the dark, staring at the empty box, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I heard it, a soft thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. I never found the doll again, but the whispers and the strange occurrences never stopped. To this day, I still hear them sometimes in the dead of night, soft and distant, like a warning or a reminder that the doll, wherever it is, isn't done with me yet. The night air was thick with the scent of wet pavement and damp leaves. My shoes made a hollow, echoing sound as they slapped against the wet concrete. I jammed my hands deeper into my coat pockets, trying to shield myself from the chill creeping into my bones. It wasn't supposed to rain tonight. The forecast had said nothing about this cold, miserable drizzle, and here I was, rushing home after staying late at work again. I cursed under my breath. I should have taken a cab. I should have done anything except walk down these dark, empty streets by myself at nearly midnight. But it was only a few blocks, I'd told myself. Just a quick walk and I'd be back home, in my apartment, wrapped in a blanket with a cup of tea in my hands. That thought had kept me going. But now, each step I took felt heavier, and the street felt longer than it ever had before. I glanced over my shoulder for what must have been the 5th time in the last 10 minutes. The street behind me was empty, dark, wet, and completely deserted. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. You're being ridiculous, I thought. You've walked this route 1,000 times. There's no one there. But my heart didn't care what my brain was telling me. It was pounding harder and harder, thudding against my ribs like it was trying to escape. I focused on the rhythmic sound of my footsteps, but it didn't help. The quiet city around me seemed too quiet, too still. No cars driving by, no people stumbling out of bars or walking their dogs. Just me, walking alone in a world that felt like it had been drained of all life. And then I heard it, a soft shuffle, barely audible, like someone dragging their feet just a little behind me. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped dead, my ears straining to catch the sound again. But there was nothing. Just the faint whisper of the wind and the distant hum of traffic from a few blocks over. I stood there for a moment, frozen, heart hammering in my chest, listening to the silence. There's nothing there, I told myself again, forcing my legs to move. Keep walking. But as soon as I started again, I heard it. That faint, dragging sound. This time, I was sure of it. I whipped around, my heart in my throat. The street behind me was empty. Nothing but dark puddles reflecting the glow of the streetlights. No one was there. I stood there, staring into the shadows, feeling the weight of my own breathing, the cold tightening my chest. My mind raced through every possibility. Maybe it was an animal, a stray cat, a raccoon, something harmless, right? But that dragging sound, it was too human. I took a deep breath, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I was tired, stressed, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Turning back around, I forced myself to keep walking, but faster this time. The faster I walked, the louder my heartbeat seemed to get. The shadows along the street stretched and twisted as I passed by, and every dark corner felt like it was hiding something. Another noise. This time it was closer, much closer, like the sound of footsteps deliberately matching my pace. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. My stomach turned, and I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins. Without thinking, I broke into a jog, my shoes slapping against the wet pavement in quick, panicked rhythm. I didn't want to look back. I couldn't. My body was on autopilot, just focusing on getting to the safety of my apartment. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I rounded the corner, my building coming into view just a block away. Almost there. But then I heard it again. The footsteps behind me were running now. Whoever, or whatever, was following me was no longer hiding. I could hear the quickened pace, the steady thud of shoes hitting the ground, closing the distance between us. I sprinted. My legs felt like lead, my lungs burned, but I didn't care. I was so close. My apartment door was right there, just a few more steps. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for my keys, my hand shaking so badly I nearly dropped them. I didn't dare look behind me as I rushed up the steps to the entrance. I could feel the presence behind me, feel the weight of those footsteps like a living thing breathing down my neck. I shoved my key into the lock, my fingers trembling so violently that I almost couldn't get the door open. But somehow I did. I stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it with shaky hands. I collapsed against the door, panting, my chest heaving, every muscle in my body trembling. For a few moments, I just stood there, back pressed against the cold door, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no sounds of someone outside. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing echoing in the small, dimly lit hallway. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any sign that whoever had been following me was still out there. But it was silent. Dead silent. Slowly, I pushed myself off the door and moved toward the small window next to it, peeking through the blinds. The street outside was empty. No one was there. The shadows from the streetlights stretched long across the road, but nothing moved. No figure in the dark. No sign of anyone. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass, trying to calm my racing heart. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe it was just the stress and exhaustion getting to me, making me paranoid. But the fear still clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't shake it. I stepped back from the window, letting the blinds fall shut, and took a deep breath. I was safe now. I was inside. Whoever it was, if they had been following me, they were gone. I turned away from the door, heading deeper into my apartment, still feeling the lingering unease prickling at the back of my neck. I needed to distract myself. Tea, I thought. Tea would help. The kettle was still half full from this morning. I switched it on, waiting for the comforting sound of it boiling, the ritual of making tea helping to steady my nerves. But as I stood there staring at the kettle, a thought crept into my mind, unbidden, cold as ice. What if they're not gone? What if they had been faster than I thought? What if they had slipped inside the building before I closed the door? I felt my breath hitch in my throat, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Slowly I turned and looked at the hallway that led to my bedroom. It was dark, the light from the kitchen barely casting any glow into the long, narrow space. And then I heard it, a faint creak. I froze, my body going cold with fear. It was the sound of a floorboard, the kind that only makes noise when someone steps on it. I wasn't alone. The apartment felt like it was shrinking around me, the walls pressing in, the silence suffocating. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My eyes were locked on the dark hallway, my mind racing with the horrible realization that whoever had been following me was now inside my home. I took a step back, my foot barely making a sound on the tile floor, my heart pounding so loudly in my ears that I thought it might burst. I needed to run. I needed to get out of here. But before I could move, I saw it. A shadow. At the far end of the hallway, just at the edge of the darkness, I saw the faintest movement. A figure. Tall, motionless, standing just beyond the reach of the kitchen light. I swallowed, my throat dry, my whole body shaking. I wanted to scream, but the sound was stuck in my throat. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my feet rooted to the spot. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. I could feel the air in the room grow heavy, thick with the presence of the thing in the hallway. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't listen. I was frozen, trapped in my own fear. And then, slowly, the figure began to move toward me. I backed away, my hands reaching blindly behind me for something, anything, to defend myself. My fingers closed around a kitchen knife, cold and sharp. I raised it in front of me, my breath coming in shallow, panicked gasps. But the figure kept coming, slow, deliberate, moving closer with each passing second. The shadow stretched longer and longer across the floor, swallowing the light until it was right there in front of me. I took a step back, the knife trembling in my hand, my heart racing so fast I thought it might stop altogether. The figure loomed over me, dark and faceless, and I could feel the cold presence of it pressing against my skin, suffocating me. And then it whispered, "I've been watching you." The voice was low, almost a growl, vibrating through the air around me. My heart seized in my chest, my blood turning to ice. Before I could react, the lights flickered and everything went dark. In the suffocating blackness, I heard it, the sound of breathing, right next to me. And then, nothing. I never expected a school lockdown to feel like this, so unreal and yet terrifyingly real at the same time. The day started just like any other. The school hallway smelled faintly of bleach, as it always did on Monday mornings, and the noise of chattering students echoed against the lockers. I remember heading to my third period class, English, half thinking about the essay I hadn't finished and half wishing it was already lunch. My phone buzzed in my pocket as I sat down at my desk. It was from my mom, a simple, "Good morning" text. I didn't have time to reply before Mr. Jenkins, our teacher, started his usual routine of calling roll. His voice was dull, like he was just going through the motions, and I was barely paying attention. That was when the intercom crackled to life. "Attention, students and staff. We are now under a full lockdown. This is not a drill. I repeat, this is not a drill. Please follow all lockdown procedures immediately." The voice was firm and calm, but the words sent a wave of tension through the room. My stomach dropped as the reality of the announcement hit me. Lockdown drills were normal. We'd had them before. But this wasn't a drill. This was happening right now. I exchanged a quick, panicked glance with Olivia, who sat 2 desks over from me. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the wave of fear ripple through the room as people realized what was going on. "Everyone, stay calm," Mr. Jenkins said, his voice louder and more commanding than usual. He moved quickly to the door, locking it and flipping off the lights. "Move to the back of the room, away from the windows." The sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the air as we all scrambled from our desks. My heart was racing and my legs felt shaky as I grabbed my backpack and followed the others to the back corner of the classroom. The fluorescent lights were off now, and the room was dim except for the faint light seeping through the small windows on the door. Mr. Jenkins pulled the blinds down and gestured for us to sit down, crouching beneath the window line. My classmates huddled together, their faces a mix of confusion, fear, and disbelief. The sound of someone whispering, "What's happening?" echoed in the silence. I sat there, knees tucked against my chest, back pressed against the cool cinder block wall, trying to control my breathing. My mind raced. Why were we in lockdown? Was it something outside the school, or someone inside? The idea of there being a threat inside the building made my skin crawl. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The silence in the room was suffocating. Every little noise, the shuffling of someone's foot, the nervous clearing of a throat, felt amplified. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to swing open at any second. What if someone came in? What if they knew we were in here? Mr. Jenkins stood near the door, watching us and keeping his eyes on the hallway through the small window. He wasn't saying anything, and that made it worse. My brain filled the silence with 100 horrible possibilities. What if someone had a gun? What if someone was already hurt? I wanted to ask him what was happening, but I didn't dare break the tense quiet that had settled over the room. My phone vibrated again, this time more insistently. I pulled it out as quietly as I could, keeping it low so the light wouldn't be too obvious. It was a group text from my friends. Mia had typed, "OMG, are you guys in lockdown too?" Jonah replied, "Yeah, we are. Any idea what's happening?" Ryan then messaged, "Heard it might be some kind of threat, but IDK." Mia replied again, "I'm freaking out." I then answered, "Same. Anyone know if we're safe?" My fingers trembled as I typed the words. No one responded right away, and I stared at my screen, waiting. It was weird to think we were all going through the same thing, huddled in dark classrooms in different parts of the school, and yet none of us knew what was going on. The uncertainty gnawed at me, making my chest tight. Suddenly a loud noise echoed from somewhere down the hall. A bang, like something heavy hitting the floor. I felt my heart lurch into my throat. Olivia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and a few people muttered nervously. Mr. Jenkins raised his hand, gesturing for us to stay quiet. His face was tense now, the calmness he'd tried to project earlier starting to crack. "What was that?" someone whispered. "Shh," another voice hissed. The noise didn't come again, but the tension in the room skyrocketed. I could feel my pulse in my ears, loud and fast. My mind kept going back to the possibility of someone inside the building, a person with a weapon. The thought made me feel cold all over. Minutes dragged on and the silence was unbearable. I wanted to hear something, anything, an announcement, sirens, footsteps in the hallway. But all we had was the oppressive quiet. I kept glancing at the door, expecting it to open, half expecting to see a shadow move past the window. I think it was around the 40-minute mark when the intercom crackled again. The sudden noise made me flinch, and I wasn't the only one. The voice that came through was different this time. It wasn't the calm, measured voice from earlier. It was shaky, almost frantic. "Students and staff, we remain under lockdown. Please continue to follow procedures. Law enforcement is on the scene. Remain where you are and do not open your doors for anyone." The message cut off abruptly, leaving a horrible sense of incompleteness in the air. My stomach twisted. Law enforcement was here. That meant it was serious. The reality of the situation hit me hard then. This wasn't just a drill, and it wasn't just some threat phoned in as a prank. Something real was happening. I squeezed my phone in my hand, knuckles turning white. I tried to keep my breathing slow, but it felt like the room was closing in on me. I wanted to be anywhere but here, somewhere safe, somewhere where I didn't have to wonder what was happening outside this locked classroom door. Suddenly there was another loud noise. This time it was closer. It sounded like a door being slammed, just down the hall. I could hear footsteps now, fast and heavy, like someone running. My whole body went rigid. Someone else was out there. Someone was inside the school. Olivia grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. She didn't say anything, but her grip was enough to tell me she was terrified. I didn't pull away. I didn't want to be alone in this fear. Then another sound. A voice, muffled but distinct, shouting something. It came from the same direction as the footsteps. The words were too garbled to understand, but the tone was urgent, maybe even angry. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I felt sick with fear, my mind spinning in circles trying to figure out what was happening just beyond the walls of our classroom. Someone in the room stifled a sob. I glanced over and saw Emma, a quiet girl who usually sat at the back of the class, with her face buried in her hands. Her shoulders were shaking, and the sound of her trying not to cry was the most heartbreaking thing I'd ever heard. No one said anything to her, though. I think we were all too scared to make any noise. More footsteps. This time, they were slower, more deliberate, like whoever was out there was pacing. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. The door to our classroom seemed so flimsy in that moment, just a thin barrier between us and whatever was happening outside. My mind kept jumping to worst-case scenarios. What if someone tried to break in? What if they knew we were in here? The lockdown procedures always made sense during drills. Lock the doors, stay quiet, stay hidden. But now, in the reality of it, the procedures felt useless, like nothing would actually keep us safe. Another bang, louder this time, closer. I could barely think. My brain was buzzing with adrenaline, fear coursing through my veins. I kept staring at the door, expecting it to burst open any second. My phone buzzed again and I nearly dropped it. It was a text from my mom. She said, "Are you okay? Please answer me as soon as you can. I just heard there's a lockdown at your school." I stared at the message, my throat tightening. I didn't know what to say. How could I tell her I didn't know if I was okay? That I didn't even know what was happening? I wanted to tell her everything would be fine, but I couldn't shake the awful feeling in my gut that something was horribly wrong. I typed out a response, my fingers shaking so badly I had to retype it 3 times. I responded to her saying, "We're in lockdown. I'm okay for now. I don't know what's happening, but I'm scared." I hit send, hoping she'd see it quickly, and then immediately regretted sending it. I didn't want to worry her more than she already was, but I also didn't want to lie. I looked at the message again and felt a knot form in my chest. I couldn't stop thinking about what would happen if the lockdown didn't end, if something terrible was already happening. The door rattled, a sharp metallic sound like someone testing the lock. My heart leapt into my throat and I froze, not even daring to breathe. The entire class went still. I could hear someone, no, several people, moving outside the door. Voices, low, quick, indistinct. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping Olivia's hand tightly. My body was trembling. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to make it stop. My mind raced with images of someone breaking down the door, a figure stepping into the room with a gun, and then another bang, this time followed by a shout. "Police, open the door!" I opened my eyes, heart still pounding in my ears. Mr. Jenkins stood frozen for a second, processing what we had all just heard. Another voice called out, louder this time. "Police, we're clearing the building. Unlock the door." Mr. Jenkins exhaled a breath, visibly relieved. He moved to the door cautiously, as if he still wasn't entirely sure if it was safe. My pulse was still racing as he unlocked the door and slowly opened it. A police officer stood in the doorway, wearing full tactical gear, his face grim but focused. Behind him, more officers moved down the hallway, sweeping the area. "You're all safe now," the officer said, his voice steady but serious. "We need you to stay calm and follow us out of the building." Safe. The word barely registered. I was still too keyed up, my body humming with adrenaline, but I clung to that one word. Safe. We slowly stood up, everyone moving cautiously as though we weren't sure we could believe it. My legs felt like jelly, weak from sitting so long in that cramped, terrified position. I could feel Olivia still clutching my arm, and I didn't let go either. As we filed out of the classroom into the hallway, the bright lights felt overwhelming. I blinked, my eyes adjusting, and looked around at the scene in front of me. Police officers everywhere, talking into radios, walking through the hallways, their weapons holstered but ready. The air was thick with tension, but there was a strange calmness now too. I realized then that I didn't know what had actually happened. Had there been a shooter? A threat? I didn't hear any gunshots, but that didn't mean nothing had happened. As we walked through the halls, I saw other students being led out of their classrooms, their faces just as pale and shocked as ours. We moved in a slow, quiet line, everyone too shaken to speak. When we finally reached the main exit, the daylight hit me like a slap to the face. Outside, a sea of flashing red and blue lights greeted us. Dozens of police cars, ambulances, and even news vans lined the parking lot. Parents were clustered near the barricades, some crying, others on their phones, all of them waiting for their kids to come out. I spotted my mom almost immediately. She was standing with a group of other parents, her face pale and strained, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. The second she saw me, she broke away from the group and ran toward me, tears already streaming down her face. "Oh my God, Jenna," she cried, pulling me into the tightest hug I'd ever felt. I was so scared, Thank God you're okay." I hugged her back, feeling the knot in my chest loosen just a little. The fear was still there, but the relief of seeing her, of being outside, away from the dark, suffocating classroom, was overwhelming. "I'm okay, Mom," I said, though my voice wavered. I wasn't entirely sure I was okay. Not yet. As we walked to the car, I glanced back at the school building. It looked the same as it always did, a big brick building with wide windows and a green lawn. But now, it felt different. I knew it wouldn't ever feel the same again. Inside, something terrible had happened. And even though I didn't have all the details yet, I knew that the fear I'd felt, the helpless, overwhelming terror, would stay with me for a long time. When we finally got home, I collapsed onto my bed, exhausted in a way I'd never felt before. My mind was still buzzing, replaying the events of the day over and over again. I didn't know when, or if, I'd ever be able to shake the feeling of sitting in that dark classroom, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the worst. All I knew was that I never wanted to go back to that place of fear again. But part of me knew deep down that I might not have a choice. The night air was crisp, the kind of cool that pinched at my skin and left my breath hanging in front of me in a cloud. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself as I left the convenience store, a plastic bag swinging in one hand. It was late, later than I had planned to be out, but I needed a few things for breakfast, and the small shop down the block from my apartment was open 24 hours. The clerk had barely looked at me as I paid for my things, and the fluorescent lights inside had felt sterile, a world apart from the quiet, dark street I stepped onto now. It was almost midnight. The city was winding down. The usual hustle of cars and people had thinned out, leaving the street oddly quiet. A few distant horns honked from somewhere deeper downtown, but here, just a few blocks from my apartment, it was calm. The glow from the streetlights was weak, throwing long, thin shadows along the sidewalk. I started walking, my footsteps echoing against the pavement. It was only a 10-minute walk, but something about the stillness of the night made the familiar path seem longer. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd made this walk plenty of times before. But I couldn't shake the odd feeling creeping up my spine, the one that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. As I crossed the street, I glanced over my shoulder, a habit I'd picked up after living alone in the city for a few years. The street was empty, the sidewalk behind me stretching out into the distance. There was no one there, just me and the hollow sound of my footsteps. Still, I felt that strange, prickling sensation, like I was being watched. I kept walking, shaking off the unease, trying to focus on the quiet rhythm of my steps. The apartment wasn't far, and the streets here were usually safe. At least, they had been up until now. My route took me past a row of small, darkened storefronts, their windows blank and reflective in the dim light. I passed a laundromat, its neon sign flickering weakly, the chairs inside empty. Beyond that was a long stretch of closed shops and quiet buildings, not a soul in sight. But then I heard it. A second set of footsteps, faint, almost imperceptible, but there. I paused, listening carefully, and the sound stopped too. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. Maybe it was just someone else walking, a neighbor, someone heading home after a late shift. It didn't have to mean anything. People walked in the city all the time, right? I started walking again, slower this time, listening carefully. For a few moments, there was nothing, just the steady beat of my own feet. But then, there it was again, soft and slow, keeping pace with me. I stopped. The footsteps stopped. I felt my stomach turn. This wasn't my imagination. Someone was there, just out of sight, just far enough behind me to remain hidden. My mind started racing. What should I do? I couldn't go back, and I didn't want to start running and give whoever it was a reason to chase me. I didn't know if they were just some stranger walking coincidentally in the same direction, or if it was something worse. The doubt made it hard to think clearly. I needed to stay calm. I picked up my pace, hoping that whoever it was would just pass by, that it was nothing, that I was overreacting. But as I quickened my steps, the sound of the footsteps behind me grew louder, faster, matching my pace exactly. That's when I knew. Someone was following me. My heart began to pound in my chest, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, making it hard to focus. I glanced over my shoulder, just a quick look, trying not to be too obvious about it. I saw a figure, just a dark silhouette under the streetlights, walking about half a block behind me. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew they were watching me. I could feel it. My apartment was still a few blocks away, too far to feel safe. The narrow alleyways and closed storefronts around me made the street feel like a maze of shadows, offering little in the way of safety. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my fingers shaking as I unlocked it. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That someone was walking behind me? I decided to call my best friend Lauren. She was my go-to for everything, and I needed to hear a familiar voice right now. Something to break the oppressive silence. As the phone rang, I kept walking, my eyes darting between the street ahead and the shadowy figure behind me. Lauren answered on the third ring. "Hey, what's up?" "Lauren," I said, my voice lower than I expected, barely above a whisper. "I think someone's following me." There was a pause on the other end. "Wait, what? Where are you?" "I'm on my way home, but there's this guy. He's been behind me for a while now, and I don't know what to do." "Where are you exactly?" she asked, her voice instantly serious. "Do you want me to come get you?" "I'm a few blocks from my place. I think I can make it if I just keep moving." I tried to sound confident, but my voice wavered. "Don't hang up. Keep talking to me," Lauren said. "If he gets too close, run into a store or something." I glanced around, but everything was closed. Even the bars were dark. The only option was to keep walking. I could hear the figure behind me now, their footsteps growing louder, more deliberate, as if they knew I was aware of them and didn't care. My breath was shallow, my heart racing. I tried to stay calm, but it felt like the street was closing in on me. My apartment felt a million miles away, and every step I took seemed slower than the last. "He's still there," I whispered into the phone. "He's getting closer." "Stay calm," Lauren urged. "You're almost home, right? Do you see anyone else around? Maybe knock on someone's door." I looked around desperately, but the street was empty. No cars passed by, no late-night walkers, no one I could ask for help. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of my shoes and the ever-present echo of the footsteps behind me. "I'm almost at the corner," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. I was coming up on the intersection near my building, a narrow street that led into a quieter neighborhood. If I could make it there, maybe I could slip away or find somewhere to hide. But then something changed. The footsteps behind me quickened, fast, heavy. They weren't matching my pace anymore. They were closing in. I turned around, panic surging through me. The figure was running now, heading straight for me. My instincts kicked in, and I started to run. "Lauren!" I gasped into the phone, my voice trembling with fear. "He's running after me!" "Run! Get out of there!" she shouted. "I'm calling the police!" I sprinted down the street, my breath coming in ragged bursts, my legs burning as I pushed myself faster. The bag of groceries swung wildly in my hand, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting away, making it to safety. My apartment building was so close now, just a block away, but it felt like the distance stretched on forever. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding against the pavement, so close now that I could almost feel him. My lungs burned and my mind raced. I had to get to my building. The front door was always locked, and I had my keys in my pocket. If I could just get inside, I'd be safe. I tore down the street, my shoes slipping on the slick pavement as I rounded the corner. My apartment building loomed ahead, its dark silhouette offering a sliver of hope. I fumbled in my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of my keys. I glanced back just as I reached the front door. The man was still behind me, closer than ever, his face shadowed beneath the streetlights. I couldn't make out his features, but I could feel his intent. He wasn't just following me, he was chasing me. I jammed the key into the lock with shaking hands, twisting it just as his footsteps grew louder. The door clicked open, and I yanked it shut behind me, my heart hammering in my chest. Through the narrow glass window in the door, I could see him slow down, his pace shifting from a full sprint to a casual walk. He stopped just a few feet away, staring at the door. My whole body shook as I backed away from the entrance, my breath coming in gasps. I was safe now, inside the building, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. He stood there, motionless, his face still hidden in shadow, watching me through the glass. I raised the phone to my ear, my voice trembling. "Lauren, I'm inside. He's right outside the door." "Stay inside," she said, her voice tight with worry. "I called the police. They're on their way. Just stay there. Don't go near him." I didn't need her to tell me that. I stayed back, pressing myself against the far wall of the lobby, my eyes locked on the figure outside. He wasn't moving anymore, just standing there, his head tilted slightly to the side, as if he was deciding what to do next. For a moment I thought he might try to break in, but then, without warning, he turned and walked away. Just like that. No rush, no hesitation. He just turned on his heel and disappeared into the shadows of the street. I let out a shaky breath, my body sagging against the wall. The adrenaline was still coursing through me, making my hands shake and my legs feel like jelly. I stayed there for a few minutes, too scared to move, waiting for the police to arrive. When they finally did, they were kind but frustrated. I gave them a description of the man, but it wasn't much to go on. Just a shadowy figure, no clear details, no face I could remember. They took my statement, reassured me that they would patrol the area, but I could tell from their faces that they didn't expect to find him. After they left, I locked myself inside my apartment, checking the door twice, then 3 times, before finally collapsing on the couch. I was safe now, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me, the sound of his footsteps following me through the quiet streets. For days afterward, I couldn't walk anywhere without looking over my shoulder, without feeling that familiar prickling sensation that someone was watching me. Even though the man hadn't done anything, hadn't hurt me, hadn't even spoken, I couldn't shake the fear that he would come back. Every time I walked home after that night, I found myself listening for footsteps behind me, always expecting to hear that soft, deliberate sound again. And every time, I wondered if the next time, I wouldn't be so lucky. I've lived in the same house for nearly a decade, and for the most part, it's been an ordinary, comfortable home. Nothing too fancy. A modest 2-story house built in the 1950s, with a small backyard and a cozy interior. The neighborhood is quiet, and the house itself has always felt warm and welcoming, at least until recently. It all started about 6 months ago, around the time my partner and I decided to do some renovations. We had been updating the kitchen, tearing down some old cabinets and replacing the flooring. The work wasn't too extensive, but it involved removing some old fixtures that had been part of the house since it was built. Looking back, I wonder if that's what triggered everything. You always hear stories about renovations stirring up old energies, and I didn't believe in that kind of thing until it happened to me. The first sign that something wasn't right was small. We had been working all day on the kitchen, and I went to bed exhausted. I remember waking up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. At first I thought it was my partner going to the bathroom, but when I rolled over I saw he was still sound asleep beside me. I brushed it off, thinking maybe I had imagined it, and eventually fell back asleep. But the footsteps continued. Over the next few nights I would wake up to the sound of pacing outside the bedroom door. Slow, deliberate footsteps, as if someone was walking up and down the hallway. Each time, I would get up and check, only to find the hallway empty. I started to feel uneasy, but convinced myself it was just the house settling or my mind playing tricks on me. Then things escalated. One evening, I was home alone, cleaning up after dinner. My partner had gone out with friends, and I was in the kitchen washing dishes. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the living room. I froze, dish in hand, my heart racing. I turned my head slowly, half expecting to see my partner coming home early. But the room was empty. Trying to shake off the feeling of unease, I went back to washing dishes. But a few minutes later, I saw it again. A shadow, moving across the wall in the living room. This time I turned around quickly, certain that someone had to be there. But again, the room was empty. I couldn't explain it. I walked around the house, checking every room and closet, but there was no one else there. The doors were locked, and all the windows were shut. I sat down on the couch, trying to calm my racing heart, but the sense of being watched lingered. I ended up calling my partner and asking him to come home early. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I didn't want to sound paranoid. The shadow sightings continued over the next few weeks. Sometimes I would see it while I was watching TV in the evening, just a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. Other times I would be sitting at the dining table and see a shadow pass by the doorway. Each time, it would vanish as soon as I turned my head to look directly at it. I started to feel like I was going crazy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in the house. One night I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as I lay there trying to make sense of it, the whispers grew louder. They were coming from the hallway just outside the bedroom door. My partner was fast asleep, so I gently nudged him awake. He listened for a moment, but by then the whispering had stopped. He told me I was probably dreaming, but I knew I had been wide awake. A few nights later, something happened that I still can't fully explain. It was around 2 a.m., and I had woken up again, this time to the sound of something moving in the kitchen. It was a soft, shuffling noise, like someone walking across the floor. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I listened for a moment, and then I heard it again. The sound of dishes clinking, like someone was rummaging through the cabinets. I got out of bed, grabbed my phone, and tiptoed down the hallway toward the kitchen. As I approached, the noise stopped. The kitchen was dark, and everything seemed to be in its place. I turned on the light, expecting to find something out of place, but nothing was. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been in there. The final straw came about a month ago. I was sitting in the living room watching TV when I felt a cold breeze pass over me. It was strange because the windows were closed, and the air conditioning wasn't on. I looked around confused, and then I saw it. One of the kitchen cabinets was slowly swinging open on its own. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the door creak open, inch by inch, until it was fully open. Then, just as slowly, it swung shut again. I jumped up from the couch, ran into the kitchen, and pulled the cabinet door open. Inside, everything was exactly where it should be. No dishes had shifted, no items had fallen over. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I had seen. I wasn't imagining it. I started doing some research on the house, trying to figure out if there was any history of paranormal activity or strange occurrences. That's when I found out that the previous owner had passed away in the house, an older man who had lived here alone for years. According to the neighbors, he had been somewhat of a recluse, and they hadn't even realized he had died until days later, when someone noticed the mail piling up. I don't know if it's him or if it's something else, but ever since those renovations, I felt like I'm not alone in this house. My partner hasn't experienced anything unusual, but I can't ignore what's been happening. I've thought about bringing in a paranormal investigator or even moving, but I'm not sure what to do. For now, I just try to avoid being home alone at night. But even when my partner is with me, I still feel it. This presence that watches, that moves things, that whispers in the dark. It hasn't hurt me, but the constant feeling of being watched is enough to keep me on edge. I never believed in ghosts before, but now I'm not so sure. I'm not so